When the day of Pentecost came, they were all gathered together in one place. When suddenly, without warning, there was a sound, like a strong wind, gale force, in fact. Nobody knew where it came from, and it filled the whole building. And then, like a wildfire, the Holy Spirit swept through their ranks, and they began to speak in a number of different languages as the Spirit prompted them. Now, there were many Jews staying in Jerusalem just then, devout pilgrims from all over the world, and when they heard that sound, they came on a run. And then when they heard one after another their own mother tongues being spoken, they were thunderstruck. They couldn't for the life of them figure out what was going on. And they kept saying, but aren't these Galileans? Then how come we're hearing them speak in our own mother tongues? I mean, we're Parthians, Medes and Elamites, visitors from Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt and those parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene. There's immigrants here from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. There's even Cretans and Arabs here. They're speaking our languages, describing God's mighty works. Their heads were spinning. They couldn't make head or tail of it. They talked back and forth, confused. What is going on here? But some of them joked. They're drunk on cheap wine, they said. And that's when Peter stood up. And backed by the other 11, he spoke out with bold urgency. Fellow Jews, he said, and all of you living in Jerusalem, listen to these words and make sure you get the story straight. These people aren't drunk, as some of you suspect. They haven't had time to get drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what the prophet Joel announced would happen. You remember the prophecy. In those days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on every kind of person. Your sons will prophesy, your daughters also. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. When the time comes, God says, I will pour out my spirit on those who serve me, men and women both, and they'll prophesy. There'll be wonders in the skies above and signs on the earth below. There'll be blood and fire and billowing smoke. The sun will turn black and the moon blood red before the day of the Lord arrives. And that day, tremendous and marvelous, whoever calls out for help to me, God, will be saved. People, this is God's story. And what a story it is.
I can't help reflecting upon some of what has happened over the past few weeks in the news as I hear this Pentecost story again. But first, let me go back to the story from Acts for a moment. Thousands of years before this event of this first Pentecost takes place, if we were to go back to the book of Genesis to chapter 11 and the story of the Tower of Babel, languages again feature. In that context, in that story, the people were getting a bit too proud, thinking that they could build magnificent edifices to themselves, demonstrating their power and their unlimited pride. God comes into the narrative, questioning the merit and the consequence of this pride. And as a result, as the story unfolds, God introduces multiple languages and the harmony degenerates, and the people are spread throughout the world. Unity is broken, as is pride, power, and arrogance. So that was the story of division entering the world in a renewed way, causing distinctions between nations, languages, and cultures, which still plague us today. Pentecost strikes a different note into the cultural division and diversity, the cultural arrogance even of the day in which it occurred, or the period of time in which it occurred. Where different languages at Babel were a sign of separation, at Pentecost, diversity of language became one of the signs of renewed unity. There's now no distinction between language, culture, or ethnic heritage which can separate those who are touched by the Spirit. Tongues as of fire settle upon hundreds, thousands, and they were drawn together through their understanding the message of God's transformative presence in their own languages. No longer were the distinctions which had divided the nations barriers. They were no longer barriers to being caught up into the one family, the family which is known by its formative or formation in and allegiance to Jesus the Christ. So where does this sit with the news I've been following? I'll only mention a couple of things today, and I'm not going into any detail about them. But I'm thinking of the situations in America where, over the course of a few weeks, one unarmed man is shot while out jogging, and another dies from police mistreatment. In both cases, apparently, because they were black, their treatment was different to what it would have been had they been white. Let me now go back to a quote that I read quite some time ago from one of Reverend David Campton's Facebook blogs, where he reflects upon the Ashes Bakery court decision a few years ago. So different situation, but the sentiment that he expresses I want to share with you. He begins, "I'm white, I'm rich, educated and employed, married and straight. I'm in a position of privilege, and I'm painfully aware that in that sense, I don't know much. I don't know what it's like to be afraid of being myself, kicked out, or bullied, or harassed, or ignored, or rejected by a community, or scared for my life. I'm privileged." And he continues, "And with privilege come two duties, I think. The duty to speak up and the duty to shut up. Because I have a voice, I should raise it, especially when others can't or aren't being heard. And because I have a voice, I should also know when not to raise it." I'm still trying to get my head around the situations where people simply by their ethnicity are treated differently, more feared, more likely to be mistreated. These stories are much, much wider than simply being legal cases. The stories involve people who have inherent and beautiful value as humans, as human beings. People who are not issues. And when we reduce stories down to issues or sides, we forget about the people. These stories involve people. The stories of Jesus involve people. He comes as one of us, ministered to the lowliest of us, sat with the unloved, tax collectors, touched the untouchable, healed the lepers, had compassion on the condemned, the woman caught in adultery, forgave the unforgivable. "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing," as he hung on the cross. Came back to the cringing, cowering deserters, his disciples, hiding in a locked room. All about people God, and people. As I've got older and maybe, just maybe, matured a little, I find myself much less committed to issues, to dogmatic determination of what's right or wrong. I'm an introvert. I'm a bit of a loner, so I'm not always very good at it. But I find myself more and more drawn to wanting to be a person who cares and leaves the judgment to God. I want to be a person who maybe, just maybe, helps people catch a glimpse of a God who loves each one, and even me. I may be betraying a clarity of faith, I'm not sure, but I want to take that risk. Pentecost was a day when God broke down barriers that had existed for generations. It was a day when people who could not have received or conceived of being drawn into the faith of the Jewish nation, as people who understood themselves to be selected as God's people, the select people of God, a day people from any and all nations were drawn into the same relationship with this God as the Jews had enjoyed down through the centuries. Pentecost was a day when barriers were cast down, and the God whose nature had been so clearly revealed through the life of Jesus, the Son of God, was discovered by masses of people from every language and place. I've reflected upon two confusing, difficult, for us here in Northern Ireland, distant events in America. Safe, distant. However, we don't have to look too hard to find examples of division, of judgment, of persecution, of labeling, of judging people for being different from ourselves, based on issues much, much nearer to home. What does Pentecost speak into these events and the events that will follow? I'm not sure, but I am sure that God constantly breaks into history, challenging how we relate to God and to each other. To finish, another contribution from David Campton. David quoted Saint Gennadius of Constantinople, who died in 471 AD. Saint Gennadius said, "To judge sins is the business only of one who is sinless. To judge one another is a sign of pride, and God resists the proud. One who is humbly aware of his or her own failings will rarely spend great energy examining the mistakes of others." Let me say it again. To judge sins is the business only of one who is sinless. To judge one another is a sign of pride, and God resists the proud. One who is humbly aware of his or her own failings will rarely spend great energy examining the mistakes of others. Said before 471 AD, and yet so appropriate for today. And so, may the peace of God be in your heart, the grace of God be in your words, the love of God be in your hands, and the joy of God be in your soul and in the song that your life sings. Amen.